Hi, it's Louisa Dahl, and welcome to the Interactive Minds podcast, where I talk with passionate marketers, innovators, and digital leaders about their specific recipes for success. In today's show, I interview Kate Phillips from Revelian, talking about managing vendor relationships. Here's 3 things you're going to learn. 1, when it's time to transition to a new vendor and how to do it. 2, the pros and cons of working for big companies and working for small companies. And 3, some tips on how to get the most out of your meetings. Let's get into it. Today I'm here with Kate Phillips, who is the Chief Marketing Officer and Head of People Strategy at Revelian. Kate has been in marketing roles for 25 years, and it's great to have her on the show today to hear more about her role and her work. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thanks, Louisa. It's great to be here.
So, Kate, 25 years in the marketing industry is a long time. Can you tell us a little bit around how you got started and a bit about your journey to date?
Yeah, it really is a long time, isn't it? And some days it feels like it's been that long, and other days it feels like the journey's just beginning. Look, most of my career has been spent in B2B roles and predominantly in big corporates, multinationals, across a whole range of different industries. You know, I've worked in transport, I've worked in construction, government, HR, recruitment. And then for the last 4 years working at Revelian, I've really honed in on HR tech, which is a really exciting, changeable kind of a field. It's fantastic. So
tell us a little bit about that role. Sorry, tell us a little bit about what Revelian does, just for those who might not know.
Yeah. So Revelian is a small Brisbane-based Australian-owned HR technology company. And we specialise in products for the recruitment process, if you like. So many of your listeners will have done one of our tests, the psychometric tests that people really hate doing as part of going for a new job. They're often ours. And one of the things we've tried to do in the last few years is make that process a little bit less onerous by serving them up in a more game-based, interactive way, if you like. So that's been a really interesting journey to be on with the company, and there's so much more ahead.
Awesome. Now, just to go back to a little bit of the history, you mentioned you've kind of focused in on B2B roles. Was that something you did intentionally at the time, or is it just how it kind of ended up?
Yeah, look, it wasn't intentional initially. In fact, when I left uni, my focus was actually to work in agency, and I had my heart really set on being a creative in an agency.
Right.
But the career journey went a few different ways. So when I was straight out of uni, I was hired by a small agency here in Brisbane in a role where I just did anything that they asked me to do, to be honest.
Yes.
We were just coming out of a recession in the early 90s in Australia, and I was thankful for a job. So whatever those guys needed me to do, I did. So I did some creative, I did some account coordination, I did some BD, I even did some debt collection for them. And so that was a really great way to get some hands-on experience and start getting a bit of a network going in the Brisbane area. But then about 6 months into that role, it became clear to me that the director of the agency was in fact a bit of a dodgy character. And there was a few things going on that I just wasn't comfortable with. So it was pretty clear that I didn't have a future sticking with that particular agency.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was working with a client of that agency, as it turned out, who mentioned that there was a marketing coordinator's role going in their organisation, which I applied for and got, and I've been client-side ever since.
Wow, never gone back to agency, hey?
No, never have. I won't rule it out for the future, but I've really enjoyed the journey of being on the other side of the fence.
And what's been a highlight of your career, or even a turning point, I suppose, over that 25 years? Anything stand out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly that shift from agency to client side early on was really a pivotal moment that shaped the rest of my career.
Yeah.
And then I think the other one has come more recently, actually, where I made the move 4 years ago from those big multinational corporates that had been my home for 20 odd years, and moved into a smaller business. And that took a lot of adjustment, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Tell us more about that. What was that like? What was the biggest difference for you in moving from a big company to a small one?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about working in a smaller organisation is that you really are closer to the action. Big organisations can have a lot of structure and process around them, and often in a marketing role you can feel a little bit removed from the coalface of what you're actually delivering to your customers, and feel a bit separated from what's going on at the front line and what's really happening in market.
Yeah.
So the opportunity to be more involved in that and closer to that has been a real shift for me, and a really positive shift.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think I've really noticed with working in a smaller organisation is that you can be more influential. I happen to be in a senior leadership role here, so that comes with its own level of influence. But the ideas can come from anywhere, and the ability for people to be able to see those through is just so much more transparent when the place is a smaller place.
Yeah, definitely. I can see how that would work. And do you think that would impact your future in terms of directing you, to further small companies down the track? Or do you think, you want to go back to the bigger ones at some point?
There's some comfort in working in large organisations. There is, as I said before, a lot of structure around you, and often the budgets are bigger, and all of those things which can be important. The resources that you have available to you, there's often more of those. So that can be a comfortable place. But to be honest, I cannot imagine a day where I would go back to a big multinational like I was working with before.
Yeah, wow.
The last place I was working, I was responsible for 5 brands across 7 countries, which was absolutely fantastic. But I did feel like I was skating across a big portfolio without really being able to get my teeth stuck into any one thing like I wanted to.
Yeah.
So the opportunity to do that in a smaller business is much greater, and I'm loving it.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit more around your role at Revelian. It sounds like a fairly broad remit. Can you take us through what it involves?
Sure. Look, it really is a very broad remit. And I suppose another thing I like about working in a smaller business is that you're not necessarily pigeonholed into one particular area of the business or specialisation. Often there are opportunities to put your hand up and be involved in things that might be different and enable you to grow your skill set.
Yeah.
So while I am Chief Marketing Officer here at Revelian, I am also Head of People Strategy. I also have the Client Services team working for me, and as part of my portfolio there, and I sit on the Senior Leadership team, and I'm heavily involved in product. So it is a very broad remit, and no day is the same, which is fantastic. That variety can be really rewarding.
Excellent. And it sounds like you have a few different teams that you're involved in or that report to you. Can you give us a little bit of information around how it's structured?
Yeah, sure. So if I focus on the marketing team first, I have specialists in digital, in content, in campaigns, which includes things like events coordination as well as working on omni-channel campaigns. So that's a small team who work really, really effectively together.
Yeah.
I'm very, very lucky to have them. And as I mentioned before, we're heavily involved in product as well. So often a typical day for the marketing team will also include working with our developers on product direction or UX roadmap, as well as running campaigns, managing brand, managing marketing vendors, and all those things that you would expect a marketing team to do.
Excellent. And
Sorry, Louisa, you go.
Yeah, sorry, and keep going. Tell us more about the client services and the people angles as well.
Yeah. So the client services team is really the first line of tech support for our customers. And when I say customers, there is B2B customers, which are employers who use our tests as a way of, as part of their screening process for hiring new employees. But also a great deal of the time for our client services team is spent providing support and guidance to the job seekers who are taking our assessments. It can be a really nerve-wracking thing to do, to sit down in front of your device and undertake a test that you know is an important part of the decision-making for a new job. So sometimes those job seekers and candidates need a bit of support, and the client services team does that either personally or more recently through some terrific strategies that we've put in place around customer service bots, which has been a really interesting project.
Yeah, right. Excellent. Well, definitely sounds like you've got a lot going on in various areas of the business and some great touch points, as you say, across the different areas as well, which you're getting exposure to because of the size of the company. So a typical day for you, you mentioned that it doesn't look the same any day. Can you give us a bit of an example about what maybe one of your days this week would have in it?
Yeah, all right. So if I think about what my day yesterday comprised, the one thing that I think is typical in every day, and I'm sure most of your listeners experience this as well, is meetings. You can always rely on there being at least one meeting in a day, even though you try hard to keep some time spare to have a meeting-free day. So yesterday I was involved in our company-wide meeting, which we do once a month to update all employees on major things that are going on in the organisation, project strategy, celebrating wins, talking about customers and that kind of thing.
Great.
I then pivoted to spend some time on the HR and people strategy and look at how we want to shape that moving forward. I had a conversation with a potential vendor who's going to assist us in that area of the business.
Mm-hmm.
I spent some time on the integration of our upgraded version of Salesforce, which is the client relationship management system that we use here at Revelian.
Great.
And we also use Pardot as an integration for that as our marketing channel for direct marketing. So spent a bit of time on that as well. Started writing a speech for our CEO to deliver at a conference in a couple of weeks' time. And in amongst all of that, did a bit of work on campaigns, working with our marketing assistant to give her some guidance on our social strategy and to approve some content. So
awesome.
A varied day.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like you were touching lots of different projects in that day. How much of your time would you normally spend in meetings, and what's your thought on, I suppose, the productivity around meetings versus finding other time?
Yeah, too much, I think, and I'm sure I have that in common with most people.
Yes.
Look, meetings can be so valuable if they're properly structured, and there's clear outcomes and accountabilities that come out of them, and that's not always achievable, but it's something that I think is really important to focus on and work towards. We've tried to do an initiative this month called Optimising October, where the maximum time that we can spend in any internal meeting is half an hour.
Awesome.
And that's something that we learned from Atlassian, and something they do really well in their business, and we thought we'd give a go.
Yeah.
We haven't quite, at the moment it feels like I'm attending as many meetings but just shorter.
Yeah.
So we haven't
part one and part two.
Yeah, we haven't quite got that right yet.
Yes.
I feel like at the moment I would say a third of my time is spent in a variety of different meetings.
Yeah, that's not too bad by the sounds of it.
Which is not too bad. Is not too bad. I think what I would like to do moving forward is shift where I'm spending those time in those meetings. So I would be delighted if a third of my time could be in meetings with clients, hearing about what they think and listening to to what their experiences are. So that's something I'm really going to focus on.
Yeah, great.
Changing up moving forward.
That sounds really interesting, what you've been trying around the 30-minute meetings. And it's interesting, I find that sometimes, you go into a meeting and you have a meeting and it just happens to end like at 55 minutes. And it just seems like the natural progression, I think, when you're face-to-face to spend that amount of time with people. So I can see what you're saying when it's hard to cut them back. But interestingly, in the same note, I find that if I swap a face-to-face meeting for an over-the-phone meeting, they generally are all done and dusted within 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that, you just feel that need to cover more, or, I don't know, maybe have more pleasantries around the face-to-face, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right. And that's the other thing that I find is you can be more purposeful, I think, if you know that you have a very specific time limit. And that can be a really useful thing.
Yeah, definitely. Excellent. Well, as you know, on this show, we always try to delve into a specific topic to help our listeners learn some new insights. And today we're going to talk about vendor relationships, and in particular, what you can do when a vendor relationship stops working. So to get into this a little bit, can you define what you mean by vendor relationships in this context, and maybe give us a couple of examples of what that could be?
Yeah. Look, for me, a vendor is any third party who you pay as an extension of your team to enable you to roll out your marketing strategy. So that could be a media agency who assists with your above the line or below the line campaigns in terms of media buying. It could be your creative agency that you work with on the creative strategy and brand and content. It could be a PR provider who assists you with your third-party media relationships. It could even be the people who print your business cards.
Yeah.
It's really that external party to your team who enables you to completely deliver your strategy.
Definitely. And to you, what does the ideal vendor relationship look like?
Yeah, I mentioned before the extension of your team, and I think the ideal vendor really does feel like they have that role, which, if in the example of the person that prints your business cards might not necessarily be realistic, but in someone who's really working with you on your marketing strategy, I want them to feel like it is a genuine partnership. And I do want them to feel like we are all striving to achieve the same objectives and celebrating the same wins.
Yeah, definitely. So today we're going to narrow in a little bit and talk about what happens when those relationships go wrong. So can you take us through maybe an example or two? I'm sure you've had a few over those 25 years of things that can go wrong, and I suppose then how you start to deal with those.
Yeah. Look, I think this is a topic that's probably familiar to a lot of people. And no one sets out to have a business relationship end. You don't start the business relationship at the beginning with termination in mind. But look, it does happen from time to time. And you're right, I've had experience of this being a good experience, and I've had experience of this being not so great. And, look, I would say that most vendors really do want to be genuine partners to their customers and have the best intentions, but things can go wrong for a whole variety of reasons. The people working on the account might change, so momentum gets interrupted, or there might be a personality clash. There could be a communication misstep, so that the vendor is no longer really clear on your needs or how you need to work, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Your strategy could pivot as a business, which happens quite a lot too. There could be a new competitor enter the market, which means you need to shift the way that you're doing things in order to compete, or there could be an emerging opportunity that presents itself, or an emerging technology that presents itself, which means that you want to think of things and work in a different way. And the reality is sometimes you just might outgrow each other too, and that happens. And it's how you handle that next step that I think is really, really important.
Yeah. When you were going through some of those examples there around why these relationships might, head on the wrong track or perhaps sour a little bit, I guess something that comes to my mind is around performance. How often do you think performance is playing a key role in, making a decision to discontinue with a vendor?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, it's incumbent on anyone who's working in a vendor relationship to be really clear on what those key performance indicators are up front, and to make sure that you're checking in on those on a very regular basis as part of your vendor management. It can be really easy to let things drift,
yes,
and not have that structure around that relationship, but it is really important. It is really important to do.
Yeah. So if someone listening to this has a relationship with a vendor at the moment that they're going, it's just not working for me anymore, I'm not getting along with them, or we're not getting our money's worth, we're not seeing the results, what is the next step?
Yeah. Look, the ideal thing would be to have a genuine conversation to try and address those issues, and to put in place a plan with some actions and accountabilities to get things back on track, and have some agreed timeframes around that.
Yeah.
That really is the ideal. But
yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes you can go through that process and it's still not producing the outcomes that you need. So you do have to square up to a parting of ways. And that's hard. I don't care whether you have had 25 years experience like I have, or a shorter amount of time working in this field. It doesn't get any easier. It's an unpleasant thing to have to do. But there's ways to do it right, and there's ways to burn bridges, which is something you want to avoid.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I think it comes back to difficult conversations, doesn't it? And they're something that are, pretty easy to put on the back burner and avoid, because no one likes to have difficult conversations, whether they're with a vendor or a team member or anyone, I think a client sometimes too. But if they do need to have one of those difficult conversations, maybe they've tried to repair it, they've tried to speak to their vendor and give them a clearer idea on expectations, and that's still not cutting it. What's the next step? What do you do next?
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I've had to do this pretty recently, where a vendor that we had been working with for some years, and who did a sterling job of meeting our needs initially, was just no longer producing those results that the business needed. And look, that was partly because our needs had changed over time, but it was partly because their business structure was actually getting in the way of us being able to come up with a solution and move forward. And even though I think both parties worked pretty hard to make that situation work, it just became clear that we couldn't persist.
Yep.
So, you mentioned before, it's a tough conversation to have, and sometimes the temptation is to just let it drift a little bit and hope for the best. But unfortunately, that never has a good outcome.
No.
And, you do have an oh crap moment for a couple of reasons when you come to this realisation, because you do have to have that challenging conversation, and also because you have to find someone else to replace them.
That's right.
And that can be very time-consuming and a difficult process in and of itself.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is once you've made that decision, you do need to act quickly and decisively. You do need to give your vendor as much notice as possible that you're moving on, because they'll need to replace that revenue. They'll need to change the way the accounts are coordinated, or make some resourcing decisions. It's going to have an impact on their business. And so even if you're cranky at them and you want to just end things abruptly, ethically and practically, it's a really good thing to do to give as much notice as possible. And that also means that they're more likely to be more reasonable in supporting you through the transition to a new provider. And certainly that was the case with the vendor that we terminated a couple of months ago.
Awesome.
They were terrific in keeping up a level of service right to the end, giving the new provider access to everything that they needed in terms of accounts and information, etc. So in the end, that transition was pretty seamless. And we parted on good terms. They are, while it didn't work out this time, certainly not off my list to work with in the future.
Great. And I guess that's the best outcome that you can possibly have, isn't it? That,
Look,
both parties work away and go, well, we've done our best and we've left on friendly terms. And, who knows down the track where you might meet again, especially in Brisbane where, we have a habit of bumping into old colleagues in new roles all the time.
We certainly do. We certainly do. And look, you're right. That is the absolute ideal. Unfortunately, I've also had providers that I've had to terminate, but then as soon as that difficult conversation was over, really disappeared across the face of the earth, off the face of the earth. And the invoices seemed to keep coming, but that was about the level of communication. And they're the ones I wouldn't entertain working with again.
Yeah. It's pretty obvious when we say it out loud, isn't it, that we really just want to, maximise the outcomes throughout the project and all the way through, and also keep it pleasant. Now, back to that difficult conversation though, what format do you have that in? I can imagine that it's pretty tempting for people to try and do this not face-to-face or even not, speaking, but I'm assuming that doing it via email is not recommended. How have you done it in the past?
No, I try and do it face-to-face.
Yeah.
And that can be a nerve-wracking experience to shape up to. But I think a face-to-face conversation has the benefit of enabling you to provide really meaningful feedback.
Yes.
And most organisations that I've worked for and with are pretty grateful for that. One of the worst things is if a customer leaves you and you don't know why.
Yeah.
You don't really have a good understanding of what could be changed and amended in the future to prevent that happening again. So I do think a face-to-face conversation is ideal, and if you can't do that face-to-face, then at least have a phone call with the people that need to know to provide your feedback on what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, definitely.
The other thing I'd say is in that conversation, it shouldn't just be about what's gone wrong, particularly if you've worked with that vendor for a period of time. It's also a good opportunity to reflect on the things that went right and to thank them for what did work across the duration of that relationship, and then provide details on what didn't work without apportioning blame, I think is a pretty important thing to do. And perhaps some suggestions for the future.
Great suggestions there in terms of how to make it work. It's interesting having this conversation. I mean, there's just so much synergies between vendor management and employee management, isn't there?
Absolutely.
I know I'm a big fan of the phrase hire slow, fire fast. And I've read something in the past that says as soon as you come into your mind that you actually need to stop working with someone, then that is the thing you should be focusing on actioning, because it's obviously been in your subconscious for a while prior to that as well. And I think it's exactly the same with your vendors. You kind of know when things are starting to slip and going downhill, and although you can give it another shot, chances are that you need to action that and start preparing for the next phase, as soon as possible. In that, when you're looking for a replacement vendor, how long does it typically take you to find a replacement?
It depends on what they're there to do.
Yeah.
And how strategic that relationship is.
Yeah.
In the example that I've been talking about today, that took probably 3 months, 12 weeks, I would say. So it was a relatively rapid process end to end, which was great, but sometimes it can take much longer, particularly if it's a niche service that's being provided that might not have too many people in the market able to deliver those services.
Yeah, definitely. And in that case, did you have a gap then between your vendors, or did your previous vendor keep going until you found someone to hand over to?
Yeah, we had no gap, which was just fantastic. And there was literally a period of a couple of weeks where both vendors were involved in the account as they were doing the handover. So that's not always easy to achieve, but that made an enormous difference in terms of being able to continue that particular strategy pretty seamlessly. And make things a lot easier for my team as well.
Yeah, sounds like the ideal scenario. Have you ever had an instance where you've replaced a vendor and then you've had the same problem again?
Yep. I absolutely have. And that, I did a lot of soul searching about that.
Yeah.
Is the common denominator me? What am I doing wrong?
Yep.
And I probably was doing a few things incorrectly in terms of that strategy to replace.
Yeah.
And you know what I think it was? You mentioned hire slow and fire fast. I think I got that slightly out of whack, but
no, that's right.
I think that's the thing I did wrong in this particular example that I can think of, where I was so mad at this first vendor that I got rid of or parted ways with, that I immediately just went to someone else that I knew was their competitor and said, I need your help.
Right.
What I should have done is been more strategic throughout that whole process. I should have worked on a transition out plan with the first provider instead of just terminating them quickly.
Yeah.
Which left me really with some exposure and made it more challenging for me to be able to take my time in finding the right replacement rather than a replacement.
Yeah.
So very similar to your analogy around managing employees. It's a very similar sort of situation.
Yeah, definitely. And in that instance, did you then have to go through that process again, or were you able to?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, no.
I did. And I felt like a complete goose having to go back out to market in only, I think it was only a short period, 6 months or so.
Yeah.
In this with the second vendor and look for those services again. But that time I was a little bit smarter about the way I approached it, and I got it right the third time. And I also got the process a bit more sorted the third time as well.
Nice. And in that scenario, did you have any contractual issues in getting out of something, or has that played a role for you in the past?
Yeah, look, it can, and I think, I mentioned earlier on, no one goes into a business relationship with termination in mind.
No.
But it is a really important thing to ensure that you are reading those contracts really carefully before you're signing them, and being clear on what the notice period is if you need to, in fact, if either party needs to terminate that relationship.
Yeah.
Typically, depending on the nature of the relationship, it can be anywhere between 1 to 6 months notice period that's required.
Yep.
In the example that I provided just then, it was actually only 1 month
Right.
for the first provider.
Yep.
And the second provider was still in their probation period, if you like. So it was relatively easy to do. But it is something that you have to be really aware of, and there is nothing worse than having a big blow up with someone that you need to work with, and then having to endure each other for another 5 months.
Yeah, definitely.
While the contract's running out, that's just a world of pain for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Now, do you have a process in place around how often you actually review your vendor relationships, or is it really kind of driven by that contractual period?
We tend to, it varies depending on the vendor and what they're there to do. I do try and have monthly and quarterly monthly work in progress meetings with our creative agency and our media buying agency. And then, quarterly more formal reviews with them. That enables us to ensure that we're keeping things on track and being able to mitigate any risks before things drift.
Yes.
Or adjust any behaviours before things drift. it also means that I'm keeping them up to date with our strategy and our business priorities,
Yes.
which can change during that period of time. We're rapidly scaling organisations. So it provides some formal structure to enable me to deliver that feedback and that update, as well as having conversations about how things are going and what performance is and what performance needs to be.
Excellent.
And that's something I find works really well, rather than leaving it informal and until you have a structured contract review.
Yeah, definitely. And we've spoken a lot about how to manage this from the client side, from the ones who are managing the vendors. If there's a vendor listening to this today and they have a client where they can feel the wobbles in there, they think the wheels are kind of getting a bit shaky, what would you recommend them to do?
I'd recommend them having an honest conversation to ask those questions.
Yeah.
And that might be something, relatively informal to start off with. It could be taking the client out for a coffee and saying, I have a sense that perhaps there's some things we need to do differently. Can we talk about that? Or if that conversation has already occurred, then there does need to be probably a more structured, formal conversation to be clear on what's working and what's not working.
Yes.
And I think, if it is a genuine partnership, the vendor absolutely has the right to raise issues and concerns with the way things are working as much as the client does.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important part of the conversation, and having that proactive input, I think, come from partners is really important as well.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. And, one of the best, I talked before about the importance of giving meaningful feedback to your vendor if you are in a situation where you are terminating the relationship, or even prior to that when you're needing to get a relationship back on track.
Yes.
From a vendor's perspective, there's that can be really useful in adjusting your strategy. It could be things you won't even realise are happening, or that are causing issues or friction with your clients. So it can be really useful information. And from a client's point of view, it's wonderful to hear from a vendor even if the relationship has ended, to say, hey, Kate, remember you gave me that feedback a couple of months ago. I just want to let you know we listened to that and we've actually changed X, Y, Z in the business.
Yep.
That's such a great way to keep in touch with your client and acknowledge that you've listened to them. So if vendors are listening to this, I would say that's a hot tip from a client to keep a relationship alive, even if the contract has ended.
Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah, it has.
Awesome.
It has.
I was wondering whether that was a hypothetical example.
No, it absolutely has happened to me.
Great.
And I had enormous respect for that person.
Yeah, definitely. And look, I don't think that kind of stuff happens enough, generally speaking. So I'm really pleased to hear that that's been an example that's actually occurred. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and advice around vendors. I think it's a topic that is relevant to pretty much everyone who's going to be listening to this. And yet it's something that we rarely talk about, because I guess it's something that, is around that management of people and teams and how we're working, and less to do with what we're working on. And at the same time, I think they're equally as important. So it's great to have a bit of airtime for this topic. Now, before you go, though, I also had another question, or a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
You're a member of our mastermind group at Interactive Minds called The Circle, and you've been a member now for about 12 months, I think. Are you able to share with us today what you've had out, why you joined The Circle in the first place, and I guess leading into, some of the things that you've got out of being involved?
Yeah, absolutely. From a senior marketer's point of view, you run out of good professional development opportunities. I think earlier in your career, a lot of the professional development programs that exist in the market are really relevant and useful, but you hit a certain point in your career where they're not necessarily fulfilling your needs anymore for a variety of reasons. So I was really eager to have some sort of a structured forum where I could be sharing ideas and issues and challenges with people like me, people who were senior marketers in other organisations.
Yeah.
And I didn't really care whether they were in similar industry as me. In fact, I was kind of hoping they wouldn't be, because that would give me different perspectives that perhaps I wouldn't have thought of myself. And so I was really looking to have that connected sort of network of people who might have been experiencing similar sort of challenges or issues as me, or having successes that I could learn from.
Yes.
And that has just been invaluable, honestly, absolutely invaluable. I've worked with a variety of different people across my experience with the circle, from a variety of different industries and roles in those industries, always at a senior level in marketing. And it's made me think differently about a whole bunch of things and consider ideas that I hadn't considered before. So
Awesome.
it's just been terrific.
Oh, good. And look, I wasn't sure how Kate was going to answer that question, so I really appreciate your kind words there. We've seen the same thing in terms of, bringing people together in similar roles or similar level roles, but across different industries and different companies and even different focus areas. And one of the things that I find that people always find so useful is actually knowing that they're not in this space alone, that what they're going through is actually really on a parallel to what other people are going through, and also that we can learn so much from talking to others around all these elements of our roles, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and that we can get these new ideas and opportunities to explore from having deep conversations, which, as you know, I find awesomely valuable.
I do too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, we spoke a little bit earlier around how you manage your calendar and meetings. Before we end, I do have a question around emails as well. I'm always super curious to hear how people are managing their emails and what approach they take to using email in their role. What's the answer for you?
Yeah, that old inbox challenge.
Yes, exactly.
I would love to get to inbox zero, and I'm trying really hard, but I'm not there yet by any means. But I do a couple of things that have enabled me to get better at managing my inbox. It's taken a bit of effort, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
The first thing is that I try never to let the sun set on an email. Even if it's just to acknowledge that I've received it and I'll be back to the person.
Yep.
Often I find that, one, it's kind of the polite thing to do, but two, it can buy you some time and help to manage that person's expectations in terms of when they're going to get a meaningful response.
Yes.
So I find that pretty useful.
Awesome.
We use Outlook. And so I do take advantage of some of the things that exist in Outlook in terms of helping you to manage. So I use the follow-up flags to link to tasks. I use the categories tool to define things where I might be, for example, needing to take action or awaiting response from someone else before something can happen, or I just information that I want to get to and read and devote time to, but doesn't need to be handled as a priority. So,
awesome.
I find those things are pretty useful. I also love archiving.
Yes.
As soon as things are completed.
Love archiving. It feels like, I love that.
Yeah. It's such an empowering thing to do. It's like feeling like you're crossing something off your list.
Yeah, definitely. Gets it out of the inbox, right?
Yeah. Look, it's it can be a beautiful thing to get rid of some of that clutter and feel the sense of achievement when you're closing things off.
Definitely.
And I do have some pretty strict rules around unsolicited emails.
Yeah.
I've gotten pretty good over the years at determining which ones are worth a second glance and which ones can be removed from my inbox entirely quite quickly.
Okay.
So, I find that helps to structure the day too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for being on the show, Kate. It's been great to have a conversation with you around so many different angles, and thanks for being part of the Interactive Minds podcast.
Thanks, Louisa. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review. I will read it and reply. My recommended action item from today's show is to look at your vendor relationships and see if any of them might need a difficult conversation. Also, I wanted to let you know about our upcoming online workshop, Collaborate to Accelerate. It's a free training and you'll be able to get some tips on how to do your best work, access the network effect, and how to develop your influence. The video series is made up of a couple of short, to-the-point videos packed with my insights on how collaboration can be a game changer. But it's only available for a limited time, so visit interactiveminds.com now to access the videos. You can see today's show at interactiveminds.com/podcast. See you next week.